There have been some truly terrifying sci-fi films over the decades, usually starting with a bang, that immediately thrust viewers into the action. So with all that in mind, I am the always frightening Gareth. This is your favourite What Culture, and here are the 8 scariest opening sci-fi movie scenes ever. Number 8. Cube. Vincenzo Natali's directorial debut has followed his career throughout, each film putting its audience in a state of vague confusion and discordance before unveiling the thrust of the story. Cube opens with a Kafka-esque situation, as a bald man in what appears to be some sort of prison outfit awakes in an empty room, a hatch on each of the 4 walls. It's clear he's uncertain of his surroundings, or even how he got there in the first place, so he persists through one of the hatches to explore. Because why not? What happens next is fairly infamous, to the extent that noted hack director Paul W.S. Anderson has blatantly ripped it off in the Resident Evil franchise. As he cautiously walks forward, a wall of thread-thin sharp wire flies through him. His body falls to many small pieces in the shape of the title after remaining still for a moment. It's not only jarring, but it brilliantly sets up the rest of the film, where characters are tasked to find an escape route out of booby-trapped rooms, all cubes housed within a larger cube. That there's no explanation for their entrapment only adds to the dread set. Number 7. The Mist. Many have argued about just where Frank Darabont's adaptation of Stephen King's novella falls genre-wise, but a solid argument can be made that there are plenty of elements of science fiction incorporated in what is mostly an allegory for religious zealotry. After a jolting opening in which a tree crashes through the window of artist David Drayton, he's forced to go to the grocery store with his son and a contemptuous neighbor for supplies, as a strange fog gathers over the lake. Within minutes of shopping, alarms ring and a man runs in the store in a panic, followed by a wave of the menacing fog. Turns out there are creatures hidden through the fog, unspeakable, rarely fully revealed horrors that attack and brutally strip flesh, limbs, and other appendages from the stranded gaggle of shoppers. There's no official explanation for their appearance, and the ultimate conflict in the film is a showdown between blind faith and human logic. But one army officer does explain the beasts are interdimensional beings that escape through a portal at a nearby army base. So that's one explanation, I guess. More Lovecraftian terror than outright sci-fi, The Mist is a deeply cynical work, heightened by Darabont's handheld shooting style he incorporated from his previous work on The Wire. Number 6. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1978. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is on a shortlist of films that can always be remade. Its story repurposed to represent the social and political mores of the time, and with every generation since the 1956 adaptation, we've seen a new interpretation, each with a new setting. 1978, arguably the best, is easily the most frightening, and the opening scene is less about abrupt shock or terror, but an atmosphere-setting paranoiac's fever dream that only intensifies until the thrilling conclusion. As the credits roll, we witness the alien species, just globs of translucent gel floating through space, quietly invade San Francisco. They land on plant life and insidiously start to grow stems. Soon, a scientist casually picks one from a leaf, but the invasion, unbeknownst to her, has already begun. A teacher walking past her gives her a knowing look, and a priest, an uncredited Robert Duvall, sits silently on a swing set, knowing that it's just begun. Donald Sutherland's health inspector starts to investigate the duplicate bodies later in the film, wandering through the crowded city as more and more faces watch him, the soundtrack pulsating like an alien heartbeat. And while we're on the subject of Donald Sutherland films, I want to know what's your favourite Sutherland performance of all time. Throw them in the comment section down below and let's pay tribute to this late great legend. Number 5. The Twilight Zone, the movie. The film adaptation of Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone is a series of vignettes, each handled by a different filmmaker. They all range in tone, from Joe Dante's cartoonish adaptation of It's a Good Life, to Steven Spielberg's overly sentimental Kick the Can, to the best George Miller's remake of the famous William Shatner starring episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. But each individual short mostly hold their own rather well. And the cold open is fantastic. It's unlikely anyone would expect Dan Aykroyd's name on a list like this, but alas, he and comedian Albert Brooks are driving down a dark, winding road late at night. Brooks starts to play little games, speeding up and turning off the headlights, scaring his passenger. But then he pulls over, Aykroyd asking, "Wanna see something really scary?" Turning his head away from the camera, he returns as a hideous monster, eating Brooks as the infamous narration begins and the titles roll. It's scary, it's funny, and it sets the perfect tone for a film that jumps from laughter to abject terror. So well executed, the scare is even called back at the film's end. Great stuff. Number 4, Quarantine. Though essentially a shot-for-shot remake of the Spanish-language film Rec, Quarantine still manages to pack a punch, and adds one element that is absent in the original. While covering a night-in-the-life story of a local firefighting station, reporter Angela Vidal is thrust in the middle of a 911 call at a rundown apartment complex. Things seem status quo, really, until a body suddenly drops into the lobby and all hell breaks loose. Soon the survivors are locked in, surrounded by military officers ordered to shoot any who try to escape on sight, as zombie-esque creatures tear through the tenements. Now, Rec's brief, vague explanation has no basis in science, but faith. It turns out one of the residents was an agent of the Vatican investigating the transference of a demonic possession. Quarantine grounds its reasoning in the science fiction realm though, with news clippings hinting at a doomsday cult, a break-in, and a chemical weapons lab. But honestly, either film's probably worth a watch. Number 3, Re-Animator. Notorious white supremacist and horror writer H.P. Lovecraft hated the 1931 movie based on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and had trouble keeping it to himself. Almost on a lark, he set about creating his own character who obsesses over reanimating the dead. Herbert West Re-Animator was meant as parody. Thankfully, director Stuart Gordon was in on the joke, adapting the stories into Re-Animator. Most of the film is tongue-in-cheek, over-the-top violence. Even little touches like a poster for the talking heads during a sex scene become significantly funnier upon rewatching it. And star Jeffrey Combs has since become a quirky icon for horror aficionados. That said, the opening scene is no joke. It lets viewers know two things. First, this is going to be a violent ride, and second, it's probably going to push a few boundaries. The film begins at the University of Zurich, with a man in a lab coat screaming in agony. As authorities burst in the locked office door, the doctor's blood-covered face spasms, his eyes bulging before exploding out of his head. "You killed him," a nurse says. "No," replies West, "I gave him life." Cue the rip-off of the Psycho theme, and cue one of the most entertaining horror films of the decade. Number 2, From Beyond. From Beyond, the aforementioned Gordon's second and not final foray into Lovecraft's oeuvre, is very much the opposite of his comical Re-Animator. It takes the science and thematic terror much more seriously. Jeffrey Combs returns, this time as Dr. Crawford Tillinghast, who along with partner Dr. Pretorius have invented the Resonator, a device that allows the mind to see beyond what it can normally perceive by activating the pineal gland. Within moments of turning it on, strange interdimensional beings float into view of the doctors. They immediately turn aggressive, taking bites out of the scientists. Tillinghast is locked up in a mental institute after Pretorius is found decapitated, but psychologist Catherine McMichael starts to find his outrageous story credible. After a CT scan reveals his pineal gland is enlarged, reluctantly he returns to the Resonator with McMichaels and a detective. That opening kill scene is hectic and nausea-inducing enough, but things only get worse from there, folks. I'll let you go and find out for yourself. Number 1, The Void. 2016's The Void is a peculiar final entry here, with great creature effects that were largely crowdfunded by Indiegogo, and a small budget and release. It received critical acclaim, and any fans of 80s horror were awash with joy that something new but still somewhat familiar was finally in theaters again. Like the best sci-fi horror with Lovecraftian elements, The Void throws its audience into the unknown almost instantaneously and refuses to let up. Two people flee a farmhouse with one escaping, the other shot and doused in gasoline before being burned alive. The survivor is rushed to a nearby hospital run by a skeleton crew of nurses and a few doctors, only to learn quickly they are surrounded by robed members of a cult determined to keep them inside. And it isn't long into the film before a nurse is in a trance brutally murdering a patient. Her face flayed of flesh, tentacles grow, bodies are mutilated and transformed, and answers are vague at best. but it's the kind of nostalgic throwback audiences were definitely craving at the time. The creepy lot.